Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. One day short of a year ago, the Coast Guard Cybersecurity Rule officially became effective. At that point, there were a lot of questions. What exactly would inspections look like? How strict would enforcement be? What did reasonable actually mean? A year or so later, we have real experience, not just reading the regulation, but watching how the Coast Guard has rolled it out. Today, I want to focus less on the words of the regulation and more on what the Coast Guard's actually done over the last 12 months, because that's where really the biggest lessons are. Rather than walking through the regulation section by section, we're going to kind of reverse engineer the Coast Guard's priorities. If we look at what they've invested time in, that's been guidance, training, assessments with CPTs, inspector education, exercises, we get a pretty clear picture of what success looks like. I want to reiterate a point that I always make up front. The focus is on safety and resiliency, keeping things moving. This isn't a technical issue. This is an operational issue. And the Coast Guard's made that very clear in all the presentations that they've done, that is really what their concern is making sure that operations flow more than technological-based issues. So within the last year, and having spent years helping stand up Coast Guard Cyber Command and now spending my time helping ports, terminals, and vessel operators implement this rule, I can honestly say the conversation has changed dramatically. When you step back and look at this timeline, something becomes obvious. Almost everything the Coast Guard has done since the rule became effective has been focused on helping industry implement it, not enforcing it. They've produced guidance on cybersecurity assessments. They've answered questions. They've been out in industry. They've helped development assessment methodologies. That's not really the behavior of an organization looking to catch people failing. That's the behavior of an organization that's trying to raise the cybersecurity maturity of the marine transportation system. And that's what you would expect from an organization that ultimately wants industry to succeed. Make no mistake, they still want to see action, and they still are regulators. But at this phase of the game, the interest and the investment has been in helping industry to navigate this and work together with them. And I think that so long as industry does that, and you as a CISO or you as an owner-operator or whatever your position is, if you keep the focus on moving this forward, taking this seriously, and maturing your systems, then you're going to be in a good situation. None of these documents by themselves make anyone compliant. They make organizations more capable, and that's what the Coast Guard's trying to build. Every one of these resources that has been implemented helps organizations to understand their risk, improve governance, or become more resilient. And we'll share here on the next slide, the primary resource for that is the Coast Guard Maritime Industry Cybersecurity Resource Center. And you can go there and you should bookmark this. It's quietly become the central repository for Coast Guard thinking. Every time new guidance comes out, this is usually where it lands first. The resource center has become a living document. If you haven't checked it in a few months, check it periodically, because that's where you're going to see news. That's where you're going to see things pop up and everything like that, including the new cybersecurity assessment guidance and the guidance that was submitted on waivers as well, were the two recent ones that the Coast Guard submitted. And the crawl, walk, run phase isn't actually written into the regulation, of course, but if you've attended Coast Guard conferences and listened to presentations or spoken with inspectors, you've probably heard it repeatedly. I think it's one of the best ways to understand the Coast Guard's mindset. Right now, most organizations are still somewhere between crawl and walk. Crawl is about learning your environment, and that is the first step. And the guidance that the Coast Guard put out recently on the cybersecurity assessment guidance states that the first step is understanding your environment, identifying your critical systems. So that categorization is important. What systems degradation of confidentiality, integrity, or availability might result in a transportation security incident? Training was a big thing that was required as of January 12th. And really at this point, at the crawl stage, you're establishing your governance and risk program. You're looking at conducting tabletop exercises more for learning and understanding than you are validating maturity. Those exercises should be focused on unearthing different situations that you have in your environment that need to be addressed in your cybersecurity plan and need to be taken into consideration. So at the crawl phase, it's more of a learning exercise. Walk is about building the program, conducting your assessment, focusing on codifying what your environment looks like, finalizing your cybersecurity plan, which you should have drafted, of course, but you should be making tweaks to that reflect reality, prioritizing your risks and implementing your foundational controls, putting in place your segmentation strategy, getting that implemented, bringing in assistance where needed in order to do those things, and confirm that they're in place technically. Run, which we're not at from a enforcement standpoint, is about maturity, exercising through operational drills, actually measuring your performance and continuously improving. Organizations that are in the run phase are doing their operational drills as a real life exercise, and they're actually evaluating as opposed to learning. Even though learning is part of it, what we'll see is that the spectrum of or the balance of exercise to learn versus exercise to measure starts to increase. And in the run phase, everyone should know what their positions are. And it's just a matter of executing those exercises as though they were real life events, and they should be smooth at that point that you're in there. Don't rush through these phases. Each one builds the foundation for the rest. And if you try to go straight to run, you're going to end up having to just go back and go through that crawl and walk phase again. So really make sure that as you go through these different phases, that you have that foundation built before you go to the next one. This is not a sprint, although everyone should be moving with intent very deliberately. It's not a sprint. There's a year out, which is a little bit of time to do this, but hopefully you've been doing this already, or at least started going through this. So this slide answers the question everybody in the room is really asking, and that's what does good and success actually look like over time? And at the foundational maturity stage, the focus is knowing your environment, building out your governance, completing your assessments. You should be doing that now. Ideally, you've done that. And you're just, if you have, making sure that it aligned with what the Coast Guard put out as guidance. At operational maturity, it shifts to improving your controls, doing regular exercises, and refining your documentation. And at organizational resilience, it becomes measuring resilience, integrating cyber into your daily operations, and continuously improving, understanding your threat landscape and those types of things. The key point to land is the Coast Guard isn't expecting perfection. They're expecting maturity and continuous improvement towards operational readiness and operational resiliency. As I mentioned again and again, this is an operational challenge, not a technological challenge. Cyber incidents can affect all of these lists in the bullet. The first question isn't what firewall failed. It's, can vessels still move? Can cargo still be loaded? Can fuel still be transferred? Can we safely continue operations? That's the Coast Guard's perspective. Nobody gets hurt because Active Directory is down. People get hurt when operational systems stop functioning. That's what the Coast Guard is truly trying to prevent. So the Coast Guard is focused on outcomes, not just busy work that you've done to do. They want to hear the outcomes. Do you understand your risk? Can you detect an incident? Can you continue operating? Those are leadership questions. Those are not product questions. I think many organizations initially assumed that the CISO needed to be the smartest cyber engineer in the room. And I don't believe that that's what the Coast Guard intended. The CISO is the person who's responsible for governance. They should have a fairly solid cybersecurity background that's based in risk, but they do not need to be the smartest technical person in the room. They're coordinating, they're prioritizing, they're relentlessly collaborating with operators to make sure to understand the impacts if a system goes down. They're making sure the program continuously improves. It's very much a leadership role, which is why there's a C at the beginning. It should be part of kind of your C-suite. Think of them more like safety officers than mechanics. They do need to surround themselves with experts, whether internal, external, or both. But good CISOs don't need to know every technical answer. They need to be able to know who does at the lower levels, but they should be able to understand and on their own power be able to tell you what the impacts are should a risk come to fruition as an issue. The assessment isn't paperwork. It's not just a paperwork drill. It's where most organizations finally understand their environment. Most organizations discover things they simply didn't know. Unknown systems, legacy connections, forgotten vendors, single points of failure. Every assessment that we performed has uncovered something that the organization didn't know about, a surprise. I have something that I call operational drift, where when a point in time assessment is done or a ship is delivered, it looks a certain way. There's as-built drawings, there's network diagrams, all those kinds of things. But as we know, ships and shipyards and ports are living environments where people are in motion. They're deploying IoT systems, they're deploying OT systems, they're perhaps introducing a MiFi. And so continual monitoring of what your environment looks like. And that's not just sitting at your computer and running a scan. That's part of it. But it's also getting out of your chair and going and walking around. And when we go on ships, when we go in terminals, invariably we say, "What's that?" And nobody knows. And so you have to continuously assess and you have to know what it is that is in your environment and what's happening. Every captain knows you don't discover whether the crew knows emergency procedures during an actual fire. You drill beforehand. Cybersecurity should be no different. The Coast Guard loves exercises and drills. It's kind of part of our fabric, their fabric. Cybersecurity is no different in this element. Nobody would question the value of fire drills. Cyber drills should become just as routine because cyber incidents that take out operational technology systems can have similar impacts to fires from a safety perspective. So you should take those seriously. Exercises are bigger picture, coordinating across an entire event, across your entire plan. Drills are exercising one particular component of your cybersecurity plan and are smaller in scope. Folks have to do one tabletop exercise per year. That's the minimum. I'll recommend more. Drills, 2 are required per year. I would also recommend that folks be involved in their area maritime security committees and be involved in larger drills and exercises. Because what you'll find is that there's blind spots around things that you assume. How does the electric company operate? Power matters, right? And so how does the captain of the port operate? So by participating in Area Maritime Security Committee exercises and drills, you can get a wider view that might impact your smaller picture where you reside. And this is sort of a visual picture of tabletops versus operational drills. They solve different problems. Tabletops validate thinking, where drills validate the execution on a particular part of the plan. One teaches and one proves. Folks have asked me about phishing campaigns. Phishing campaigns are perfectly good drills. You're not going to want to do phishing campaigns for both of your drills and call it good. You want a diversity of drills that exercise anything from third-party vendor management to ransomware detection and how that's done and how you would react if you got ransomware, to cyber physical problems of, you lose visibility because of a camera system going out. What types of things might you do to protect those systems that are cyber-based or IT-based? So there's a lot of different things you can do with drills and you should provide a diversity of drills in your repertoire. If this framework feels familiar, it should. It's remarkably similar to the Coast Guard's safety management systems philosophy: governance, assessment, planning, training, continuous improvement. Cyber is becoming another operational management system. I'd argue it is an operational management system, and one that we just need to embrace. The Coast Guard already understands continuous improvement, and cyber is simply becoming another operational discipline, very much akin to and supporting safety management. So notice what isn't on this list. There's no perfect vulnerability score. There's no perfect asset inventory. There isn't zero findings. Instead, a year out from now, a year and a day out from now, you should be able to have evidence of progress. That evidence would include your CISO designated, your inventory established and categorized. You should be able to tell a Coast Guard inspector, we've done our cybersecurity assessment, we've identified all of these systems. Here are the ones whose degradation would result in a transportation security incident. Here's how we've taken steps to protect those. And here's where we're going, and here's where we're moving. We are monitoring, detecting, and responding to those. We have completed our training. We do have a risk register where we're tracking risks, and everyone understands their position within the organization and their role. So if I were preparing for an inspection, I'd rather be able to show 6 months of documented improvement than pretend I had a perfect program. And I think that that's one of the keys here. Everyone just needs to mature as they go through this. So I believe inspections over the next several years will become less focused on individual technologies and more focused on demonstrating that the program is actually functioning. Do you understand your environment and monitor it for changes, threats, and vulnerabilities? Do you have diverse and/or redundant mechanisms for continuity? Are you ensuring that safety risk is managed? This focus, again, is not technology for technology's sake. This is operational. When the Coast Guard comes to you, they're not going to have a ton of technical questions. They're going to have a spreadsheet, and they're going to expect that you know your answer and that you tell the story. Ultimately, CISOs own the story of their company. They own the responsibility for the organization. And as CISO, you should be able to very confidently lay out to the Coast Guard what your strategy is, what your risks are, that you've identified those. So if your organization feels behind, don't try to solve everything this quarter. You do have a year. That is actually a shorter time than a lot of us think, but pick one meaningful milestone every month and start making progress towards it. Momentum and continuous improvement matter far more than a perfect program. Take days 1 through 30 to understand your environment, designate and empower a CISO. I know you don't have to have a CISO designated until 2027, but that's too late. I don't know, how you would do this without somebody acting in the CISO position. I don't know how you would do a cybersecurity assessment or cybersecurity plan without somebody already being there. Somebody needs to be the designee for that, the CISO in waiting or interim CISO, whatever you want to do. But you need to be conducting your assessment, identifying your critical systems, and then moving into the next 2 phases to where you conduct a tabletop exercise with all the environmental understanding that you've developed throughout that. After spending the last year talking with operators, regulators, inspectors, and industry partners, I think the biggest misconception has disappeared. This regulation isn't asking organizations to eliminate cybersecurity risk. It's not. It's asking them to manage it like every other operational risk. The Coast Guard has an incredibly difficult challenge. Every port, every facility, every ship is different. Every operator is different. Every risk profile is different. And that's why it's very challenging to present a one-size-fits-all. You simply can't. Everything that's being presented is outcome-based. The cybersecurity framework, which is referenced, is a maturity model. It's not like NIST 800-171, where everyone's at the same baseline of protecting the very same information the same way. Everybody's different on this. That's why the rule is intentionally risk-based. The Coast Guard isn't asking everyone to build identical cybersecurity programs. They're asking every organization to understand its own risks and manage them properly. I'll leave you with one final thought. The organizations that will succeed over the next 5 years won't necessarily be the ones with the biggest cybersecurity budgets. They'll be the organizations that build cybersecurity in the way they operate every day. That's resilience, and that's not measured by preventing every incident. It's measured by how safely and effectively you continue operating when one occurs. Thank you all for your time today, and at this point, I'll take any questions that you have. Okay, so one question is, where would you begin with the cybersecurity assessment? So when you start, you have to know what you have, right? And I think that if you understand your environment well already, that's good. If you have a small environment, that's good. If you want to bring in a third party to help you with understanding, what systems might be in scope, that might be a good idea as well. Somebody who's been through something like this before, it's always useful. And I think that getting that help up front, is more valuable than later in the process. So I think the sooner you bring in a cyber expert, if you don't already have one, or somebody who understands terminal operations, or both, that investment pays off over time by doing it earlier. That answers that question. What do I see happening in a year? Okay, so in a year, what I see happening is that the Coast Guard is going to have their hands full. They're going to have a ton of cybersecurity plans to evaluate. And so they're going to be going through all those. They're going to be evaluating those, making sure that they're realistic, making sure that they meet all the requirements of the final rule, that the policies are in place to do that. They're also going to be looking to make sure that you're taking this seriously. And I think that that's where things happen. I think that the only time that the Coast Guard, in my humble opinion, I'm not speaking for the Coast Guard, I'll make that very, very clear. I think that the Coast Guard, the only time that a fine or some type of punishment would come into place is if you've just not taken this seriously. If you're taking this seriously and trying to move the ball forward, that's what the Coast Guard wants to see. They've made that pretty clear at places like the MTS ISAC Cyber Summit and in other public forums where they've done. They've made it very clear that they want to see progress. They don't have the time or the resources to be able to know your environment. So again, you need to own your story, and you need to have a very, very good story about how that goes. I have a question about waivers. I don't know exactly how the waiver process goes, but here's what I do know. The Coast Guard made very clear that before you submit a waiver, you have to do your assessment. And to me, that made all the sense in the world, because how can you submit a waiver if you haven't accurately assessed your systems? And so what you do is you take your inventory, you categorize your systems, and if you don't have any cybersecurity infrastructure whose degradation or downright outage would result in a transportation security incident, and you can document that and put together a good piece, then I believe you have a pretty strong case for a waiver. You can't just say, we're a small facility, we don't really have anything, we're done, give us a waiver. You have to do your due diligence, and that's through the cybersecurity assessment. And so the assessment is not necessarily an assessment as a lot of people think about. A lot of times when I think about cybersecurity assessments, it's I'm coming in to test your controls. The cybersecurity assessment, as the Coast Guard talks about it, includes scoping. What I would call scoping, right? Like discovering everything that's out there, categorizing everything that's out there. And then only after you've done that can you say, hey, look, it doesn't make sense for us to invest in these types of things that give no operational or safety or economic benefit, or reduce any risk. The juice isn't worth the squeeze on this. There's nothing for us to really protect, and protecting doesn't move the needle on resilience. So I think that doing that assessment and the Coast Guard putting out there and making it very, very clear that they're not even going to evaluate a waiver unless you've done a cyber assessment, I think is a very good move. Ships. So I have a question here about ships. Um, yeah, the Coast Guard had talked about potentially making ships delaying the enforcement of cybersecurity on ships because of the issues with some of the legacy systems not having the capabilities to meet those needs. Some of those systems are decades old. And so that was, before two-factor was really a thing, or before, a lot of these controls were considered. And so in many cases, we're tied to the manufacturers. And having to recapitalize your entire shipboard system around shipboard schedules, the money, the manufacturer's technical capabilities, and things like that, means that that's going to be a bigger challenge than some of the other areas where we're looking. So I don't know whether or not the Coast Guard will or won't provide a delay for that. What I would do is not wait. I would go ahead and do everything you can. And if you have systems that are that would preclude you, they're cost prohibitive to replace or to get to those reasonable standards, then put countermeasures in place, so, physically or otherwise. Policy, process, and physical security can overcome some technical challenges as far as security goes. It all plays in. And so I would still plan on doing your due diligence, because again, this is an operational issue too. Do your due diligence, take this time to do that, and either you will or you won't get a bit of a reprieve or a delay on where that is. But again, this is an operational thing, not a compliance or technical thing. So you should be wanting to do this anyways to understand what your risk is within your bigger portfolio of cyber risks. Any other questions? Second. No. All right. Well, the last thing I'll leave you with is we're all in this together. I think that one of the biggest things that we can do is share resources, get to know your friends, get to know your competitors even. Rising tide raises all ships. So I make that appropriate nautical phraseology. And I think that by participating in Area Maritime Security Committee meetings, by joining webinars, by making friends with those people who are in your port, sharing best practices, everyone can achieve this goal that I think we all want. And so I would encourage everybody to participate within the community and to help each other out through these. I'm always available for questions. Please feel free to hit me, cliff@madsecurity.com, or LinkedIn, or however else you want to hit me. But thank you very much for your time, and have a great day.